Good evening. I'm Andrew Jewett, and it's my pleasure to join you as the moderator for this book talk with Johns Hopkins alumnus Patrick L. Schmidt. Before we begin, I want to thank our online viewers for joining us today. I encourage you to ask questions through the Hopkins at Home Watch Now chat. We'll address as many questions as we can during the Q&A session in the final portion of the live stream. I'd also like to thank our hosts in the Office of Alumni Relations Lifelong Learning team for making this event part of the Hopkins at Home program. Hopkins at Home is a digital platform for alumni and the public to experience Hopkins lectures like this one virtually. A few words about myself. I'm a U.S. historian currently writing an institutional history of Johns Hopkins that will appear in conjunction with its 150th anniversary in 2026. More generally, my research has explored the entanglements of science, politics, and culture. I've published 2 books in that area and have recently been looking at the environmental justice movement as a case study. But the star of the show tonight is Patrick Schmidt. Patrick is an attorney in Washington, D.C., focusing primarily on matters related to Latin America and the Caribbean. He received a BA magna cum laude from Harvard, a JD from Georgetown, and in 2003, an MIPP from SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Schmidt also completed graduate studies in the PhD program of the University of Madrid. And now Patrick has written a book titled Harvard's Quixotic Pursuit of a New Science, The Rise and Fall of the Department of Social Relations. The book tells the little-known story of how some of the most renowned social scientists of the 20th century struggled to elevate their emerging disciplines of cultural anthropology, sociology, and social and clinical psychology. Scorned and marginalized in their respective departments in the 1930s, for pursuing the controversial theories of Freud and Jung, they persuaded Harvard to establish a new department, promising to create an interdisciplinary science that would surpass in importance Harvard's big 3 disciplines of economics, government, and history. Patrick will start us off with a brief overview of the book. I'll then have a chance to ask him some questions in an interview format, and in the final part of the session, we'll turn it over to you, the audience, for your questions. But first, give us a sense of what this book is about, Patrick.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Andy, for taking the time to do this and for reading my book. And also, of course, I'd like to thank Johns Hopkins and the Office of Alumni Relations and their team for putting this together. I'd like to start by reading the opening paragraphs of the book because that provides an overview. On January 29th, 1946, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University voted to create a new department. It was a daring experiment by a conservative institution, integrating social anthropology, sociology, social psychology, and clinical psychology into a single department, leaving 2 diminished departments, psychology and anthropology, in its wake. No other university had such a department. At Harvard, it had been years in the making, following turbulent infighting in the affected departments and reflecting wider movements in the social sciences before and after World War II. The faculty approved the new department at 5:30 p.m., but the years of germination and conflict left one important detail overlooked. What should Harvard call it? According to one witness, 6 p.m. was a sacred hour of adjournment for faculty meetings, so an undignified scramble ensued to find a suitable name. The accurate but suffocating name was not in contention. The Department of Sociology, Social Psychology, Clinical Psychology, and Social Anthropology. Some would suggest the Department of Human Relations, which captured the spirit of the venture, but the faculty vetoed it immediately because rival Yale already had an Institute of Human Relations. The name also appeared to infringe on the Harvard Business School because human relations was an area of study there. The clock was ticking, the faculty grew restless. Finally, at 5:59, someone proposed social relations, and because the faculty wanted to go home, they approved the name without debate. This new band marched at the head of what David Reisman, the renowned sociologist, keen observer of higher education and himself a member of the social relations department, termed the academic procession. Its life and death was witnessed by all. Throughout its history, social relations boasted a faculty of some of the most important scholars in American social science of the 20th century and produced graduates who had also become notable scholars. Alongside the academic accolades, however, scandals divided the faculty and cast the department in an unfavorable light, not just at Harvard, but nationally and even internationally. Social relations is notorious for faculty such as Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, reborn as Ram Dass, who researched the effects of psilocybin on students, and Henry Murray, who traumatized undergraduate Ted Kaczynski, later the Unabomber, in a 3-year-long abusive psychological experiment. The 1960s zeitgeist roiled the department beyond the Leary Alpert scandal. The Radical Students for a Democratic Society infiltrated the teaching staff of the department's largest course in 1968, promoting a political agenda with farcical academic standards and igniting a bitter controversy in social relations and throughout the Harvard community. The idea for social relations was hatched in the 1930s. Scorned by traditional interest in the Harvard departments, rising faculty stars in anthropology, sociology, and psychology fled their antagonists, seeking to create not merely a new department, but a new social science. The refugees were Talcott Parsons, Gordon Allport, Henry Murray, and Clyde Kluckholm, supported administratively by Dean Paul Buck. They promised an interdisciplinary science that would supplant the elder social sciences of history, government, and economics in the ability to explain human behavior. An audacious aspiration, critics found it as imperious as it was implausible. Inspired by the new and controversial works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the group met clandestinely to plot the bold venture, giving their efforts a conspiratorial air. They called themselves the levelers in recognition of the many levels they believed the study of behavior required. Their big break came when their vision was legitimized by interdisciplinary research during World War II, conducted by the research branch of the War Department and the Foreign Morale Analysis Division of the Office of War Information. Government agencies employed teams of clinical and social psychologists, cultural anthropologists, and sociologists to study issues important to the war effort, such as assessing the morale of the Japanese as well as the spirit of our own troops. Some of the levelers and other early members of the Social Relations Department had worked in these wartime research efforts. Such collaboration under urgent conditions led to a productive exchange of concepts and methodologies across the established disciplines. This teamwork had a lasting effect on the participants, many of whom were determined to deepen and institutionalize the exchange after the war ended. Already moving towards an interdisciplinary focus before the war, the founders of social relations had concrete experiences of collaborating with scholars of other disciplines. They also had a grandiose confidence that they could study and solve any social problem by employing methodologies from their constituent disciplines. Indeed, sociologist Talcott Parsons, the intellectual ringleader of the group, believed it was possible, drawing on these disparate disciplines, to develop a single theory to explain human behavior. The expectations for the social sciences ran high in post-war America, and Harvard's social relations department was at the epicenter of the enthusiasm. Historian David Engerman explained, "The lofty aspirations to apply social science to improve society has long been a part of American life, but in few moments and in few places was that aspiration as fervently held as at Harvard in the 1940s. David McClellan, an early member of social relations and later its chairman, recalled, "We had a wonderful time dreaming dreams about how to foster basic science in a way that would also contribute to human progress." But only 25 years later, it all fell apart. And so a good portion of the book is explaining how things fell apart. And Andrew, I'm sorry, I jumped your question, but I'm happy to get back to that if you'd like.
Thanks for that summary, Patrick. Yeah, it's a fascinating story with so many wrinkles. I'm glad we're going to be able to dig into a few of these episodes in more detail. But I have to ask you before we start about the history of the project itself. It's had a very long gestation. Can you tell us a little bit about how this book came about?
Yes. Well, it started with my senior honors thesis at Harvard, where I decided to write a history of the social relations department. And many of these professors were still at Harvard and willing to be interviewed. So I did a combination of an oral history as well as a documentary research on the history of the department. And I was able to interview some of these giants of the social sciences of the 20th century, Talcott Parsons, David Reisman, George Homans, B.F. Skinner, who was a critic of the department. He didn't like it at all. And as a personal note, I had my work study job at Harvard was in the library of the social relations library. So I had a connection to this topic and some of the people in it for a long time. I came across a letter that I had received from David Reisman, who wrote me after reading my thesis at the time, that encouraging me to publish it. I sort of forgot about the letter until 2009. I came across it in some papers in my parents' home. And I thought, wow, David Reisman, the author of The Lonely Crowd, a very well-known sociologist, thought this would make a good book. And so I decided I would write the book, and that was it.
Well, we're glad you listened to David Reisman. It's wonderful to have this see the light of day. Let me start by asking you about these key players in the formation of the Department of Social Relations, these four figures, the levelers. You had Talcott Parsons from sociology, Gordon Alpert in social psychology and personality, Henry Murray from clinical psychology, and Clyde Kluckhohn in social and cultural anthropology. There had been personal connections between them since the 30s, but these connections were based on deeper intellectual affinities that they had been exploring for a number of years by the time this department took shape. So what did these four figures, these levelers, have in common with one another? And how did these shared commitments set them apart from colleagues in their own departments at the time?
Well, their intellectual affinities were based on two things. First, three of these levelers, Parsons, Kluckhohn, and Murray, were early advocates of psychoanalytic thought, which was just being introduced in the US in the late 20s, early 30s. They all had undergone analysis. Murray had undergone analysis by Carl Jung himself, and was one of the main conduits for bringing psychoanalytic theory into the American Academy. And so they all believed in its efficacy, and they wanted to incorporate it in their work, whether that was psychology, sociology, or in Kluckhohn's case, anthropology. The second affinity is they were members of the famous Pareto Circle at Harvard. And this was an informal seminar organized in 1932 to examine from an interdisciplinary perspective the works of Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto. And it was organized by Lawrence Henderson at the business school. Other members included the economist Joseph Schumpeter and historian Bernard DeVoto, among others. And so they actually met in this seminar, and that's where they learned they had this common interest, not just in Freud, but in an interdisciplinary approach. So you had those two things merging. And then the third thing they shared was, because of those two interests, they were marginalized in their departments. Their respective departments wanted nothing to do with an interdisciplinary approach or Freud or Jung. So there were really three things that brought them together in a very, personal as well as professional way.
Mm-hmm. So in between then, the late 30s, and when this department is formed, you have World War II. So tell us more about the impact of the war. What did social scientists do during the war? How did that experience transform their thought and their practices? And then how did these levelers try to implement those changes at Harvard after the war?
Yeah, well, World War II really changed everything in terms of the behavioral sciences. The government hired over 1,700 psychologists to help research, research on the war to help the Allies. And they looked and they examined things from the morale of our troops, how to improve it, how to research the morale of our enemies and how we could knock that down, how we could sell war bonds to the public. They looked at things all across the board. And this was a big change because social scientists had never been used in this way by the government before. In the New Deal, they were used, but it was mainly to catalog what people were doing and thinking. But now social scientists were being asked to make predictions, important predictions. I mean, life and death predictions. So this was a huge sea change for social sciences. And I would also add that they were also used by the Office of Special Services, the OSS, which is a precursor to the CIA. And Henry Murray was the chief psychologist. Henry Murray from Harvard was the chief psychologist, or one of them, at the OSS. And his main focus was how you break a spy down. If we capture a spy, how you break them down, as well as how do you vet who would make a good spy for us, who could not be broken down. Clyde Pluckhone, the anthropologist, was employed by something called the Foreign Morale Analysis Division of the Office of War Information. And his specialty was examining the Japanese. We didn't know much about the Japanese. We knew more about the Germans. And so he was looking at, particularly at the morale of the Japanese. If we took certain actions with that, how could we break down their morale? So this was a huge change. And the other factor that's important is that all these social scientists worked together without distinctions to their disciplines. The military wanted answers. They wanted answers quickly, and they could care less what department you were from, what discipline. They put them all in a room and just said, you guys give us the answers. And so when the war ended, and by the way, this was considered successful. The social sciences contribution to the war effort was considered a success. And so this legitimized in the view of the levelers, in the sense that they now had experience working in an interdisciplinary setting. It was successful. And when they got back to Harvard, they said, this is the future in the academy. We should do away with these arbitrary distinctions among and between the disciplines. And that really made a big difference. And it was to Harvard, to the administration, it also helped legitimize what the levelers were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned arbitrary distinctions, and I want to push you a little bit more on that point. In several places in the book, you write that the Department of Social Relations failed in its mission because its leaders never found a common theoretical language that could unite them. There was no coherent theory, so there couldn't be a new discipline as such. And it raises a bigger issue for me. Like, could it have worked, right? Was there, in fact, a theoretical framework that could have united these subfields, or was it actually impossible to integrate or maybe even coordinate them? And in other words, like, do the familiar boundaries between disciplines actually map onto real distinctions in the world, or are they just arbitrary conventions?
Yeah, and I mean that's a great question. I mean, if we think of the established disciplines, there's sort of an understanding among the scholars as to what that discipline is. Mm-hmm. These were all new disciplines. Sociology, psychology, and cultural anthropology didn't even exist until the late 1920s, early 1930s. And there was a huge division of opinion about whether they were even disciplines at all. At Harvard, that was a question. So they were already on sort of shaky ground in terms of whether they were disciplined. And then on top of it, they were trying to create a new discipline, which was based on these other disciplines. So they were at the fringe of the fringe in terms of what they were trying to do. The question is, could it have worked? Could there have been a theory pulling on this all together? And I think that's very challenging to do. I'm not sure that there was a way to do it. Talcott Parsons believed there was. He had his way of going about it. He got, in the first 3 years of the department, he got a huge amount of money from the Carnegie Endowment to try to make this theory. And he took a year or two off. He recruited a team to help him write this theory. And he did this for 2.5, 3 years. And it failed. It was a book. It was called the Toward a General Theory of Action. At Harvard, everything has a nickname. That book was somewhat famous. It was called the Yellow Book because this is the Yellow Book right here. I have a prop. And it failed. I mean, it didn't unite the disciplines. Even his own fellow faculty members that were co-authors of this, they had so many dissents, footnotes, qualifications. It rendered it almost meaningless as a theory. And that book was published in 1951. It was not adopted as the ideology of the department. There was a famous blow up between George Homans and Talcott Parsons in the faculty meeting about that. And after that, there was never an attempt to bring the disciplines together within social relations. And Talcott Parsons was really just on his own in thinking this could be done. And the other thing that made it very difficult for the department was that the rest of the academy still had the traditional departments. Harvard was the only one that had this odd department. So what social psychologist Donald Campbell calls the ethnocentricities of the social sciences, or ethnocentrism of the disciplines, they have their own ecosystem and they're not going to change. And they weren't going to accept this new creature. So they were going along their merry way. The job market was the same. The journals were the same. They didn't want to have anything to do with this new creature. So I don't think a theory could have worked. And Talcott Parsons gave it his best shot, but he failed.
Yeah, and the way you put it in the book is to say that the department really all along in its practice was multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary. And certainly by the late 50s and arguably earlier, even Parsons had sort of given up on this idea that he could really integrate these things, right? But even so, David Reisman, you mentioned earlier, it comes kind of late in the game, but he thinks this is a productive experiment on the whole. Do you agree with Reisman? I mean, does the department foster important achievements of some kind despite this lowering of expectations?
Well, I do agree with Professor Reisman in the sense that, first of all, the social relations department there was no net loss of productivity. All these superstars in the faculty still did great work, but it was not interdisciplinary. So Harvard and the academy didn't really lose much, but it didn't gain this interdisciplinary focus that Parsons and the others wanted. But there was an atmosphere of an ethos, if you will, of interdisciplinary approach. And I think that ethos produced graduates who then went on to take an interdisciplinary approach. But the approach, and I say this in the book, the approach was an interdisciplinary approach that was under one skull. It was in that person, as opposed to the faculty as a whole. David Reisman is interdisciplinary, but he never did much collaborative work with somebody from another discipline. And the social relations produced graduates. Clifford Geertz, the well-known anthropologist, had his PhD from social relations. And he went on to be, I think, quite interdisciplinary in his approach. Howard Gardner, a social psychologist who is still teaching at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and he wrote his memoir, and he talks a lot about this in his memoir, how his interdisciplinary approach was totally instilled in him by people like David Reisman, Eric Erikson, and Jerome Bruner. I forgot Eric Erikson. He was a member of the faculty too, and obviously an interesting character. So I think in the sense it did have great contributions, but not in the way that Parsons and others intended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating question to think about counterfactually what would have happened if these people had just been in other departments. Would they have had the same sorts of achievements? Right. And so would Bruner have still initiated this sort of cognitive revolution?
Well, I was going to mention, I'm glad you mentioned that, Bruner. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because Bruner, I think Bruner's sort of creation of the cognitive revolution, it was a reaction to the failure at Harvard in both the traditional psychology department and the social relations department. Mm-hmm. For our listeners, Jerome Bruner was a psychologist. He had his PhD from Harvard in the traditional department, but he joined the social relations department. And he was very frustrated at Harvard because he said the people in psychology, like B.F. Skinner, and what he called the rat box men, the people who were studying rats and pigeons, the behavioralists, they only cared about studying what they could measure. And the social relations crowd, Henry Murray and others, were too focused on abnormal psychology, and no one was studying just normal people and how they think, how children learn. So he got all this money in a grants and started his own Center for Cognitive Research, and basically left the department except in name only. And so I would contend that one contribution that social relations may have made was they sort of pushed Bruner to really focus on his cognitive revolution. So it was sort of a reaction to the failure. So I can't prove that, but I think there's something to it.
Yeah. I mean, as it happens in the 1960s, then the department suffers through this string of kind of black eyes, right? These highly publicized incidents, you alluded to them earlier, that gave it a reputation both locally, nationally, and beyond, as you say, for having low intellectual standards, violating social norms, and so forth. But tell us a little bit more about those scandals and their effects on the program. This is sort of one of the juiciest parts of the book, of course.
Yes, well, so in 1958, Timothy Leary was recruited to come to Harvard to join the social relations department. He was a mainstream psychologist. He was a clinical psychologist. And David McClellan, who was the head of that group at Harvard, brought Leary in, and he was quoted as saying, well, he wanted Leary to get things going at Harvard, and little did he know what he had unleashed. So Leary came to the department, and he was, as I said, a mainstream psychologist. He liked to study people in the real world as a clinical psychologist. But his first summer after Harvard, he went to Mexico, and he tried the magic mushroom. And that was it for him. I mean, he called it a religious experience. And when he came back to Harvard that fall, he was convinced that psilocybin was the future of psychology. And he dedicated himself to studying this. And he was joined in that effort by another psychologist at Harvard, Richard Alpert, who listeners may recognize his later persona, Ram Dass, which he became in the late 60s. So the two of them joined together to do this psilocybin research. And I use the word research rather loosely because at the time, what they would do is they would give the psilocybin. Oh, and they had this synthetic drug. Timothy Leary you couldn't, it was impractical to give the mushroom to people because first of all, apparently it tastes awful and it wasn't practical. But Leary wrote the company, pharmaceutical company Sandoz. He wrote him a letter on Harvard Stationery saying, I'm doing research in this. Could you please send me synthetic psilocybin or psilocybin? And they sent him back a huge quantity and said, good luck with the research. Let us know how it goes. And of course, it wasn't illegal in those days. So, but that led Timothy Leary to kind of be the Johnny Appleseed of psilocybin. You're just giving it out to people, you know, sort of willy-nilly. But their approach in giving the psilocybin to undergraduates caused a huge scandal at Harvard. Because even though it wasn't illegal, it did affect people's brains, and Harvard didn't like this. But Leary and others pushed back saying, well, academic freedom. This is our research. This is the University of William James, and it's only fitting that it be done here. William James himself experimented with nitrous oxide and other things. So this went back and forth, went on for 2 years. And it finally came to a head. They finally got Leary and Alpert to agree not to give psilocybin to undergraduates. Alpert broke that agreement. He gave psilocybin to an undergraduate that he was friends with, and he was fired. The first professor to be fired at Harvard, maybe the only one in the 20th century. And Leary always claimed he was fired, but he just stopped showing up, which is sort of in keeping with his mantra of turn on, tune in, drop out. He just stopped showing up for class, and they took his name off the payroll. So, but the legacy of that, there's two legacies of that. One is that it got in the newspapers, and it got in the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine, all these articles about this scandal at Harvard. And the general public, outside of, you know, some of these universities in the general public didn't know about these drugs, psychedelic drugs, but now they did. As a result of this scandal at Harvard, it was now out in the public. So I do say that I think Leary helped kickstart this counterculture movement, and the scandal at Social Relations sort of kickstarted this counterculture movement, which Leary went on to become, of course, the icon for that movement. And the other thing that Leary did, he sort of set back legitimate research on psilocybin, because Nixon branded Leary the most dangerous man in America. That's what he called Leary. And then he basically pushed to outlaw all research on psychedelic drugs. That law was passed in 1970. And so overnight, all research, legitimate or not, was shut down. And it was only in the last few years that it's restarted. And in fact, I think Leary would be chuckling now, because last year, almost 60 years later, Harvard started researching psilocybin again, but at the medical school, you know, as it should be done, you know, under very controlled circumstances. And psilocybin is being proven to be of great help to a lot of people with PTSD, anxiety, and other things. So that was the scandal that really gave a black eye to the department. Outside of Harvard and inside of Harvard, the administration started looking at this group and saying, what is going on over there? So that was the first of the black eyes, as I called it. And it really split the faculty professionally, because some faculty really believed this academic freedom argument. And so there was a real fissure in the department. Then later in the 60s and 68, the Students for Democratic Society proposed got a young professor in social relations to sign off on a new department, a new class. a new course, and the course was called A Radical Perspective on American Society, which sounds somewhat innocuous. I mean, sociology was in the department, and you wanted to look at what the writings were about from the radical perspective. And anyway, the course was approved, but what Harvard didn't realize is this was a Trojan horse for the SDS to take control of this course, and they became the teaching fellows, and it became a very popular course at Harvard because the grading was practically everybody got an A just for showing up, or you could do a drawing, or there were no exams. And the SDS was proselytizing, basically using this to build what they called a bridge to get these left-leaning Harvard students to take action, because they felt, well, these Harvard students, we got to get them to take more action. And they succeeded because they took over the University Hall in April of, I guess it was April of '69. That was led by about 13 teaching fellows from this department, as well as the professor. They all got arrested in this takeover of University Hall. And this black eye, also an embarrassment to the department in Harvard, because this made national news. And it split the faculty politically, the conservatives versus the liberals. And this was kind of the last draw in terms of the faculty. They just felt they couldn't trust one another. It really was another instance where the administration looked at what is going on with this department. It's sort of out of control. What are we going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me squeeze in one more question before we turn to the audience, because we're getting right up to the ends of the social relations story here. And you note, and for those of us who think about institutional changes at these elite universities like Harvard, like Hopkins, you note that strong administrators played key roles in both the creation and then the dissolution of the Department of Social Relations. Can you tell me a little bit more about their roles?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's sort of a bookend in terms of these strong deans. There was Dean Paul Buck in 1946, who supported the Levelers to create this department. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian of the social sciences, so he knew that area. And he had also created another hybrid department in 1946. It was called the Department of Engineering and Applied Physics. He put those together. So he was very much thinking in this interdisciplinary approach. He really believed the lesson of World War II research was to go interdisciplinary. And he was the one that pushed it through. And he was the dean, not the president. Conant was away in Washington for most of the war effort. So Buck was a very powerful dean, and he really pushed this through. It wouldn't have happened without him. And then on the dissolution in 1972, finally the sociologists, they wanted to leave. They wanted to go back and have their own separate department. And so you were left with this, some psychologists, some anthropologists, and Harvard wanted to put all the psychologists back together in one department. And the dean at that time was John Dunlop, who was a professor of economics. He had been a labor negotiator. And so he didn't have much patience for these psychologists who did not want to get back together. And so he called them in a meeting, and he basically, after they voted it down, he called them in a meeting. He said, listen, I want you to take another vote, and I want to remind you that the dean makes up the budgets for your departments. And then they voted to go back together. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about Dunlop is that back in the 41, as a young economics professor, he was supportive of the Levelers. And in fact, he was a co-author of a document they wrote called A Common Language for the Area of Social Science.
Mhm.
This was kind of their manifesto of what they wanted to do. And he was one of the co-authors. So it's really interesting that he was the one that drive the final stake through the heart of social relations. And there's one other black eye I should just mention quickly. It was sort of a black eye retrospectively because it didn't come to light until 1992. But in 1958, Professor Henry Murray, who had been at the CIA doing the research on how you break spies down, continued to do that research at Harvard, but he was using undergraduate students as his subjects. And he would pick students who were either supremely confident in themselves or very lacking confidence and socially awkward. And he picked one student to go through this experiment, a 3-year-long experiment. And this student was a 16-year-old, brilliant in science and math, but very socially awkward, had a lot of issues. And that student was Ted Kaczynski. And Murray recruited Kaczynski without explaining what the nature of the experiment. And in fact, Murray, because Kaczynski was underage, he had to get consent from Kaczynski's mother. And he did not fully disclose to the mother the harshness of this 3-year-long experience. And the mother, there's a quote I have in the book, when they asked the mother, why did you allow your son to go in this experiment? And she said, well, I knew that Teddy had issues, and I thought these nice psychologists at Harvard would help him. And I'm not justifying anything Kaczynski did later in life, but it really was unacceptable that they would do this to this underage student's mother. And Kaczynski says it was the worst experience in his life, undergoing that 3-year harsh experiment, trying to break him down. So that didn't come to light until 1992, but it's another black eye when you look back at the department, and particularly at Henry Murray, who was considered he was a brilliant psychologist, but it really, really damaged his reputation. And there were a lot of articles in the New York Times, Atlantic Magazine. So I just wanted to mention that as a posthumous black eye, I guess.
Right. Well, I have lots of questions I'd love to ask, but we need to turn to the audience. Those of you out there, again, you can ask questions through the Hopkins at Home Watch Now chat. They will be passed along to us. Let me start with a question that's sort of continuous with the last one I asked about institutional change, and this is from Cindy. Do you think that the collapse of social relations can still serve as some kind of cautionary tale for universities 50 years later? What lessons could or should a current college president, for example, learn from your book?
That's a great question. It definitely is a cautionary tale for university administrators and department heads, because this interdisciplinary approach, it's become sort of a buzzword that is thrown around in the academy. Oh, we're going to do, and also in government, but in the academy, it's thrown around. Oh, we're going to do this interdisciplinary approach. We have to look at this problem from an interdisciplinary way, and we're going to put these people together in an institute or department or what have you. And they say this rather lightly without thinking of how little, at least from my perspective, truly interdisciplinary work takes place. I mean, it's more multidisciplinary. And I just think that they should make sure they have their terminology straight, their goals straight in what they're trying to accomplish. Because you hear this buzzword interdisciplinary all the time in the academy, and I just think that they're being a little fast and loose with that term and the goals. And that's not to say there are some problems that require an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach, but I just think that sometimes in the academy, people are being a little careless with that term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the interdisciplinarity of the post-war social sciences was often problem focused, right? That we have a problem of poverty, we have a problem of morale that we want to bring just different perspectives to bear on. Nowadays, it tends to be a little more thematic if I'm trying to generalize about it. But I wonder if something like this could happen again. Is this likely to happen in these sort of proliferating studies departments? Sort of piggyback on Cindy's question. We have X studies and Y studies and Z studies. Do you think that they suffer from some of the same issues?
Yeah, I think they do. I don't know if anybody would try a department per se. They certainly would try these institutes and other things. So yeah, I think it's probably going to continue despite this particular cautionary tale. But as you said, on the other hand, there are problems that do require a multidisciplinary approach, at least. I think of solving climate change, or as you said, poverty, or any number of things.
Mm-hmm.
I just think the academy should be a little clearer in what they're trying to do and how they're trying to accomplish it.
Mm-hmm. Mir has a question that picks up on this as well. Disciplines have associations with their own institutional interests outside of universities that resist combining, right? And then as the institutions where most Americans receive their higher education are starting to combine disciplines due to financial pressures, can this Harvard episode provide any guidance in this situation, our current situation of belt tightening and cost cutting and so forth?
Yeah, I think perhaps for some smaller universities that are really having budgetary problems, they might see this as kind of a solution. And I'm thinking back to something that David Reisman wrote to me about his son, actually, who had got his PhD from Harvard in the social relations department, and he went to teach at Carleton College in, I think, Minnesota, which is a smaller school. And he says the reason his son was hired for the faculty is because he could teach both cultural anthropology and sociology. Mm-hmm. He could cover both of those. And Professor Reisman said, I don't think that my son would have been hired were it not for his ability to cover both of those. But then on the other hand, the counterweight to that is that the way to get ahead as a scholar is to be really good in your discipline. You want to be known as the best social psychologist or the best sociologist. You don't want to be known as somebody that, spread yourself around, because, you're going to be hired by, most cases in a larger university, you're going to be hired by a traditional department, and they're going to be looking at your publications in that particular field. So it might be helpful to some of these smaller schools, or the budget tightening that's going on in so many places. That budget tightening could be something that could be helpful to these multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary scholars.
Mm-hmm. We have a follow-up question from Cindy, building on this discussion. One other question: what was the most surprising thing you learned from your primary sources in your research, or going back to it years later? What surprised you the most?
Well, that's a good one. I think a couple of things. First of all, I was surprised at how casually Harvard did things back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. They made these decisions. For example, I go back to the early 30s, Talcott Parsons. He was an economist. He had his PhD from Heidelberg. and he was in the economics department at Harvard, and he was sort of frustrated there. So he said, well, I want to switch to sociology. And so he just switched to sociology. Now, I don't know, Andy, you can tell me if a professor could do that today very easily.
Few of them, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So that and then even in the 60s, when they were approving these courses, like the SDS course, it was just, oh, okay, this course, we'll approve it. You know, I mean, so I was always sort of a bit surprised at how casually some of these things were done. And then the other surprise was, I think, the role that academic politics and the personalities played in this, because in the psychology department in the 20s and 30s, these two groups of psychologists, the experimentalists like B.F. Skinner, who were very science-oriented, versus Henry Murray and Gordon Allport, who were more socially oriented, they really despised each other. And from 1935 to 1945, those groups of psychologists weren't even on speaking terms in their own department. There was no agreement on what psychology was. Graduate students didn't know what they could write a thesis on. I mean, so it was not just the intellectual debates, but it became very personal. So I guess I would say that was another surprise.
Yeah, and you point out that in some ways that folks calling for institutional change were able to mobilize some of those situations, and to make in some ways a similar argument at the beginning as about at the end, is that Harvard needed to keep up with something happening out there in the world, right? That was going to happen to the social sciences, and it either needed to be on the cutting edge or it was going to get left behind. And in one case, that means integration. And on the other case, it meant reuniting the traditional disciplines.
Yeah, exactly. And Talcott Parsons played that hand very well at the beginning, because he convinced Harvard that it was going to fall behind if it didn't do this interdisciplinary approach. But then sociology in the 70s or late 60s was moving away from psychology and moving towards economics and government. And so the sociologists said, why are we in this department with these psychologists? We have nothing in common with them anymore. We want to be aligned with the great powers, as David Reisman called them at Harvard, the great powers of government, economics, and history. Of course, those powers didn't want to have anything to do with sociology. That's a whole nother story. But yeah, so it you know, the bookends of this were really kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, we need to wrap up in a minute, but there's one more observation that I wanted to read from the chat, more just a point than a question, is that Johns Hopkins has created this group of interdisciplinary professors, these Bloomberg distinguished professors, right, who have their positions across different university divisions, right, in different institutional units. And maybe that's one way to institutionalize certain modes of interdisciplinarity within individuals, but also connecting those programs without actually combining them together into one, but creating a kind of decentralized web of networks across them. That may be one way to go. And it's certainly something that Hopkins has been excited about experimenting with in recent years. But we do need to wrap up. Let me once again congratulate Patrick on the book. Thank him for sharing his time today. It's been a really fascinating conversation for me, and we hope you all out there enjoyed it as well. Many thanks to all of you for attending. If you haven't already, I encourage you again to pick up a copy of Patrick's book, again titled Harvard's Quixotic Pursuit of a New Science, The Rise and Fall of the Department of Social Relations. We have provided a link that you can use to purchase the book in the chat. You will also receive a follow-up email with a recording of the program and a link to our upcoming event schedule. We hope to see you soon at future Hopkins at Home events. You can always find upcoming programs and register for them at events.jhu.edu. Until then, we wish you all a good night.